1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, we had in the country enormous hopes for everyone. Hopes of freedom, but also of solidarity. 3 decades after that, with the election in the United States of Donald Trump, it seems that a lot of those hopes after the fall of the Berlin Wall have reached a moment of danger. If the fall of the Berlin Wall meant openness, dialogue, and tolerance, the idea of building a new wall between Mexico and the United States represents the opposite. This siege and harassment we see against our civilization, understood as a humanistic civilization of freedom and respect. This harassment, this siege can be seen at all levels: intolerance, extremism, a disdain for cultural diversity, and disdain for scientific knowledge. We live in a time full of these threats, a time also marked, as Professor Noam Chomsky says, by a profound abyss of inequality. Throughout the following weeks, we are going to have the occasion of listening to some of the best minds of Mexico, of the United States, and the world, discussing the major problems of our times. Thanks to a very fortunate coincidence, the Guadalajara University and the National Autonomous University of Mexico, both institutions of higher education, the biggest and most important institutions in Mexico, some of the most important of the planet, have joined efforts so that in these days we can listen to these great thinkers, academicians, and artists trying to find not only critical paths and resistance in the face of these threats against civilization, but also possible solutions. On the side of our university, on behalf of this university, I want to thank for this fine-tuning process, and this that took place thanks to the vision of Dr. Grauer and the General Secretariat and also the Community Secretariat, together with the coordination of cultural events in this university. I want to thank the University of Guadalajara and, of course, also the International Book Fair of Guadalajara for having joint efforts with all of us so that we were able to accomplish this important and crucial colloquium throughout these weeks that starts today in the UNAM facilities in this beautiful Nezahualcóyotl hall that will continue in different spaces of the university here next week, and from there we're going to be going to Guadalajara to continue this until the closing session in the following weeks within the framework of the International Book Fair in Guadalajara. For this inaugural panel, I want to particularly thank the State University of Arizona and the Origins Project of that university and the General Directorate for Community Services that have made this possible for us to start this colloquium with the best auspices, but also with some of the most brilliant minds of Mexico and the United States, countries that are still sister countries with great fraternity, and their great minds are ready to break all walls. Thank you.
Hace uso de la palabra la
Dr. Stephanie Lindquist is recognized.
On behalf of President Michael Crow and the faculty, staff, and students of Arizona State University, I welcome you to the first Origins Project event to take place in Mexico. We thank the National Autonomous University of Mexico and Rector Enrique Grauer for co-hosting this event with us and with the University of Guadalajara. Thank you also to Rector Tanatu Bravo for your partnership. We are particularly honored to hold this event in this famous hall, widely known as the premier venue for cultural and arts events in Latin America, and named for a renowned Aztec poet king, a fitting namesake. At Arizona State, we value our relationships with universities around the world, but we hold particularly dear our relationships with our neighbors at UNAM and UDG, who share with us in Arizona a similar culture and many similar climate and many similar cultural and historical experiences. This Origins Project event explores a topic fitting to our partnership, focusing as it does on a matter of profound importance to the United States and to Mexico, with our common border, our shared climate, and thus shared challenges in facing the consequences of global climate change. This is also an ideal topic to be addressed and explored in an event organized through the Origins Project. Led by renowned theoretical physicist and cosmologist Lawrence Krauss, the Origins Project aims to tackle broad issues of global importance that cut across boundaries of science, public policy, humanities, and social science by bringing together the world's keenest intellectuals in dialogue over these issues' theoretical and practical dimensions, and over solutions for a better future for our children and for their children. One key objective for all Origins events is that the ideas presented by the world's greatest thinkers be disseminated widely and developed as resources for students around the world. For those reasons, this event is being simulcast and will remain available for future viewing in classrooms and elsewhere via access on the ASU Origins website. We hope this inaugural event for ASU, UNAM, UDG, and Origins Project is the first of many such events. We are grateful to have the opportunity to collaborate with such distinguished universities in Mexico, and we give our thanks to Professor Krauss and his team for assembling such a remarkable panel of experts for our edification. Thank you, and enjoy the event.
Muchas gracias y que disfruten del debate.
Now we give the floor to Mr. Iscoal Tonatiuh Bravo Padilla, General Dean of the University of Guadalajara. You have the floor, sir. President of the University of Guadalajara. Good afternoon to all of you. Distinguished President of UNAM, my friend as well, and dear Vice President and Director of Academic Affairs of ASU, and Coordinator of Cultural Activities of UNAM, dear academicians and students and teachers and leaders of our great national institution, which is this National University of Mexico. It's a great pleasure greeting you at this Nezahualcóyotl Hall due to the inauguration of this very important meeting, the Siege Upon Civilization from Wall to Wall, organized jointly by the National Autonomous University of Mexico and the University of Guadalajara, with the participation, which is considerable participation of ASU. For this institution, for the institution of Guadalajara, it is a great honor for us to collaborate with our maximum education institution in this colloquium, with the participation of international intellectuals, to hold a dialogue on trends and contradictions of contemporary society and the different challenges and global repercussions. It is exactly universities as open spaces for pluralism, critique, and free discussion of ideas that are called upon to be a counterweight to fundamentalisms of all types. and after the conclusion of the Cold War, although this constituted the end of the bipolar world and gave way to the democratic regime in different countries of the world, which allowed for the possibility of hoping for the construction of a world based on respect for civil rights and human rights as well. Today, this perspective is seriously challenged. Today, various fundamentalisms threaten with diminishing or doing away with multiple progressive conquests that were accomplished in various centuries: gender equity, equal rights for sexual minorities, affirmative actions for the balance of opportunities among ethnic groups and social classes, and the reversion of the effects of climate change, the status and the respect of the refugees and the migrant flows, and even rights of people with disabilities. This attack seeks to exclude social sectors to maintain the privileges of just a few, generally identified with certain profiles, not only in North America, but also in Europe and in other parts of the world. The most preoccupying thing is that this has to do with hegemony that they are trying to accomplish, and disdain for science and respect for others. And they want to be single readings and interpretations of reality, even at the counter-current level of clearly established data. As of information and communication technologies, these discourses now have a global scope, and we can see them reflected in stances that are clearly anti-feminist, racist, and classist of all types. An example of this, which directly affects the university sphere, is represented by the decision made by the President of the United States to suspend the Deferred Action Program, DACA, of youth who arrived in the States very young, and they've lived there. They've been established there for a long time, and they grew up and they arrived with their parents who were migrants. No doubt, this is quite a preoccupation. Regressive, xenophobic, regressive positions against migrants that try to limit the flow of people flying away from poverty, natural catastrophes, wars of ethnic, religious intolerance, or even political intolerance to exercise the right to a dignified life. We should ask ourselves, are we witnessing the end of an era marked by two walls, the Berlin Wall that fell in 1989 and the one that is being built in the border between Mexico and the United States? We never imagined that precisely from one of the nations with one of the most advanced democratic regimes, we would have the biggest symbol, anti-civilization symbol. And climate change is also reaching unsuspected levels, and this forecasts for the first time in 4 years talk about world carbon emissions that will be increasing towards 2017. Scientists believe it's urgent to go back to permissible levels before 2020 to avoid global warming. In the face of this program, as a condition for the development of countries and regions, it is important for us to vindicate our protection for the environment, recognition of human dignity and equality, and fundamental freedoms of people, and also mutual respect among nations. That's why we're celebrating this meeting, vindicating peaceful coexistence of peoples in a global world, a multicultural world, a multi-religious, multi-ethnic world, and as said by the Sustainable Development Goals. And part of this colloquium, as already said by Dr. Volpi, will be taking place here at UNAM between November 15th and 23rd. The second part will be taking place 25th, 26th, 27th of November within the framework of the 31st edition of the International Book Fair in Guadalajara, organized by our institution of education. And of course, we will be waiting for you there to continue this dialogue. And I want to take advantage of this occasion to also thank the president of UNAM, Dr. Grau, and also the coordinator of cultural activities, Dr. Volpi, for the efforts and synergies generated with our institution in Guadalajara and the Arizona State University to make this great forum possible. I fully recognize, of course, the participation of the Veracruz University and the National Geographic Foundation and the World Council of Peoples for the United Nations and all those who have supported us in this extraordinary meeting in different manners. And of course, Dr. Mara Robles from the University of Guadalajara and Mr. Raúl Padilla, who chairs the International Book Fair. And finally, I would like to manifest my gratitude and acknowledgement to all the intellectuals and academics participating in this international colloquium, Siege upon Civilization from Wall to Wall, and I truly hope that all our purposes and academic and humanistic objectives are met. Thank you and great success.
Escuchemos a continuación las palabras.
And now we'll hear from Enrique Graue Vihers, President of the National Autonomous University. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Dr. Tonatiuh Bravo, President of the University of Guadalajara. Let me tell you that some 7 months ago, the president of Guadalajara University and I had a conversation about these conferences that we had planned independently, and we decided that we are public university, so why not organizing a joint effort? And that is how we came up with this set of conferences. At the end of the day, this is what we're here for, to inaugurate this effort. Thank you very much, Tonatiuh. Stephanie Lindquist, thank you very much for joining us. Jorge Volpi, thank you. Jorge Volpi, along with Mr. Padilla, together they organized our agenda. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Volpi. Dr. Volpi was right when he said that it was 28 years ago in November 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. He was right when he said, and of course that's what happened, that after its disappearance, apparently it calmed down the issues back then and created a better world where there were no physical and ideological barriers, and in a world which a global society could live in peace and brotherhood. Obviously, that's not what happened. But the fall of the Berlin Wall, it is a symbol indeed. It is a symbol of hope and bears witness that it doesn't matter how large the obstacles are ahead of us, when these obstacles are deep-rooted in intolerance and lack of reason, eventually those walls will fall. And that is precisely the case of the Berlin Wall. And that is going to be the destination of the wall that Trump is trying to build. A demagogical, racist, very likely of the mastermind creating that wall. If that wall is ever built, it would be an offense to us as a nation, but it should not be a concern for us. Those are going to be walls that we would put graffiti on, that we will jump over, or we will use those walls in various ways that we will imagine and circumvent. But those barriers are going to disappear. However, we do have walls in front of us that are a concern, and we should take action. I mean the walls that are not visible, and these walls are more harmful than a physical wall. The true walls ahead of us are in those places where inequality exists, and that's the barrier that we haven't been able to make collapse. Walls that divide us as society and represent a threat for our society, because behind those walls that divide us, there is a huge gap of loneliness, despair, misery, and inequality. And that wall of social inequality is not a wall that we only see in our society. Those walls have been built by ourselves, have been built blindly in the path towards progress. If we decide to leave this planet, and if we travel to the International Space Station, we would see our world from the distance. So far, the world would be that we would not be even able to identify social differences. We wouldn't be capable of identifying the harmful effects of our civilization to our planet. And the furthest we are, the easier would it be to forget about every single concern that we turn a blind eye on. For example, we forget that the CO2 levels in our air are the highest in the last 650,000 years, and 925 million people are hungry in the world, and that only in 2015 people died to preventable diseases, 5,900,000 children before they turned 5 years of age. If this situation persists, social inequality, it is foreseen by the WHO that in the next 13 years, 69 million children will die. Two reasons related to lack of health care. But we do not live in the outer space. We don't live in the International Space Station. We live in this reality. We live in a globalized world, and we should face our reality in order to hope for a sustainable planet and a society where social justice prevails. And of course, Mexico is not the exception in terms of social inequality. We are the 11th world's economy, and we are also the most unequal country in the list of OECD countries. And that is the wall that we need to bring down, the wall of poverty, the wall of lack of opportunities, the wall of inequality in schooling, the wall of despair, and the wall that creates marginalization. Of course, brings along migration and crime. That wall that we need to bring down from every angle, from its foundation to the top. And we have to make it collapse from our own actions as a society and individuals. The other walls, isolationist and protectionistic walls that are only targeting that we ignore our reality, those walls are condemned to fail. From this room, and on behalf of the university, we reject those walls. Those walls are despisable and cause indignation. From wall to wall, from the Berlin Wall and the walls that we are facing today, this set of conferences, The Siege Upon Civilization, will analyze the state of our civilization and will analyze potential solutions, different issues, and the different routes that our society could choose upon. This way, in the upcoming days, the 40 speakers that we will have the opportunity to listen to over the course of 7 days in UNAM and afterwards during the International Book Fair, we will address the most pressing issues relating to the economy, democracy, the cyber world, arts and culture, equality, protecting the environment, and poverty, marginalization, and violence. All of these would be topics that all of our international experts will address. This colloquium, as President Tonatiuh Bravo says, is the creation of the synergy of two public universities, UNAM and the University of Guadalajara. We're having a conversation where we have more than 620,000 students altogether. And we were aiming to have a similar conversation in our campuses. Therefore, we decided to join efforts to be here together. This is the beginning right here at the Nezahualcóyotl Hall in UNAM. And the upcoming events here in Mexico City and in Guadalajara within the framework of the International Book Fair of Guadalajara. President Tonatiuh Bravo, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your friendship and your solidarity. As usual, many people participate in the planning of these events. I would like to thank Dr. Jorge Volpi for all the efforts made by your office, and also Jorge Volpi's counterpart in the University of Guadalajara. I would like to thank Dr. Javier de la Fuente for all the support given to the General Directorate for Community Affairs and the Vice President of Arizona State University, represented by Stephanie Linkwitz, and the School of Science of UNAM. Thank you as well. The speakers that you will listen to are exceptional, and the topics they will address are of the utmost importance. That is why we have a large audience. To all of you, the attendants of this symposium, be welcome, and I hope that you enjoy each one of the lectures that will help us to understand our current world better. Through our race shall our spirit speak.
Es así como damos por terminado este
Thus, we conclude this opening session. Thank you so much to all of you and good afternoon.
Dijo que esa sería su estrategia para forzar al gobierno mexicano a pagar por la construcción de un muro a lo largo de la frontera.
Hablando del muro, que el presidente Trump dice que inicialmente pagará a Estados Unidos, pero que no
Aumentaría la tarifa por otorgamiento de visas y la de los
physical, tall, powerful, beautiful southern border wall.
A continuación, damos paso.
Now, let's continue with the Great Origins Project, climate change, environmental, social consequences for Mexico and the world. To moderate this meeting, we give the floor to Dr. Lawrence Krauss, Director of the Origins Project.
You and I will go together. You just hold it. Right here.
No, you're in the end. No, all the way.
All the way. You're here.
Here. Okay.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here in this beautiful auditorium in this wonderful city at this great university and to share with you the very first Origins event outside of the United States. And we're very proud to have it here with our partners, the universities here that you've met, and also, I should add, another partner of ours, the City of Ideas. Several of us will be moving on after here to Puebla to talk as well, and I thank them for their cooperation as well. The Origins Project, as you've heard, tries to bring the best minds in the world together to discuss forefront ideas in science, the purpose of which, however, is not just to lead research, but to disseminate those ideas to the public. Because for a democracy to work, the public must be informed. And all of the important issues that are important for governance in the 21st century relate to issues of science and technology, and from health to medicine to the energy, the environment, security. And we are here to discuss a great question, the question of climate change, but in particular its relationships to social and economic consequences, running the whole gamut. And I'm very happy that we have an amazing panel of experts and intellectuals to discuss this, and I hope you'll enjoy it today. Now, I want to give a brief overview of some of the ideas that we'll be discussing. And it's particularly important to us and particularly appropriate, we thought, to have a meeting on climate change here in Mexico. There's an expression I learned, a Mexican expression I learned, which is that when the United States gets a cold, Mexico gets pneumonia. When the United States gets a fever, we'll see what happens. Mexico is next door to the only major industrial country in the world in which all three branches of parts of government, the party that controls them, denies the existence and the reality of climate change. That puts you in a unique position, perhaps an unfortunate one, but a unique position. Because the world will be affected by the policies of the United States, and Mexico in particular, as we'll talk about, is particularly susceptible. And this global issue, as the rector said, means there are no walls between countries. Everyone will be affected. And Mexico, because of that, and because of your relationship with the United States, is in a unique position to potentially affect policy, as I'll talk about. But I want to quickly just remind you of a few things. First of all, I said the reality of climate change. Climate change is real. This curve which you've seen, which came from Charles Keeling, began to study the rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from human industrial activity. And this set the basis for the modern realization that we are in a unique stage in the history of the world. This is not model, this is reality. Now, for some people, the fact that at the time that this curve ended, we were at 390 parts per million, a part per million doesn't seem like very much. And many of the climate change deniers in my country say, well, what effect can that have? But when you put it in a long-term perspective, when you put it in a long-term perspective, you see this is the history. These are the levels of climate change over the last 500,000 years. And you can see the variation, the natural variation, and where we're at now is unprecedented in the history of the world in the last 500,000 years. And that, given basic laws of physics, will have an effect. And a number of the people on my panel study this and have studied this for their life's work. One of the effects appears to be a rise in temperature, which is predicted based on the laws of physics. Now, the temperature has risen at various times during the 20th century, but this curve, when you look at it, makes it clear that we are again living at an unprecedented time. I want to emphasize this is not a model. This is reality. Climate change is happening now. The question of interest will be what will happen in the future, and that depends on how we act as a planet today. Now, some people say that the climate change is just due to the nature of the sun and its changing activity. But one of the things we know is when you put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we predict a number of effects, including an increase in temperature. But one of the clear bits of evidence that this is due to carbon dioxide is the fact that when you put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, some of it dissolves in the ocean, forming carbonic acid, and the oceans become more acidic, ultimately causing great stress to many things in the ocean. We are already living in Ocean 2.0, but you can already see this is, again, data. This isn't models. The ocean is becoming more acidic. Carbon dioxide is having a global effect, even at the level of a few hundred parts per million. Now, that's one of the reasons why we know it's not the sun. The question you might ask is, why should we care and worry? Is it really bad? Well, the models are models about what the future will bring. But this is interesting. Based on ice cores in Antarctica, you can try and measure not just carbon dioxide levels, but temperature. And you can also model the temperature. And you can compare the models of what was predicted over the last 500,000 years to what actually happened, and they're not so bad. But what scares me, and the reason that I don't think we can just leave this as an open question, is to look during the same period. There are records of sea levels, in this case it's from the Red Sea, and these are sea level changes in meters. The sea level changed during that time by 80 meters. 80 meters. Not inches, not centimeters, but 80 meters. This kind of effect is so dramatic that we need to begin to ask ourselves the question, what can we do? Because if we are facing the possibility of sea level change in meters, hundreds of millions of people around the world will lose their land. And the social and political and economic impacts of that can be extreme, as we'll talk about. Now, some people say we can't afford to deal with this problem now. Let's wait. Let's leave it to the next generation. And there are a number of reasons why we can't. One is that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now will remain in the atmosphere for at least 600 years. This means that every year when we add more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, it stays there. And it means that the industrial activity for the last 100 years is already there. And these are two graphs of what will happen potentially to temperature depending upon when we turn this off. And that means that every year we wait, the problem becomes worse. And it means that if we want to try and reduce the impact of climate change, it gets harder every year. This curve is actually, I just learned, due to Richard Somerville. But if we try and reduce carbon dioxide to a level where the human output is such that we're not radically changing climate, every year we wait becomes harder because there's already more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's why we have to act now, begin to act now, and continue to act for some time. This is not a problem, as Dan Schrag will undoubtedly talk about, that can be solved quickly, but it's a problem that has to start being solved now if we're going to do anything about it. Now, we're high up in Mexico City, so you might say you don't care about sea level rise. Maybe some of you own property and you hope that it will become seashore property. But there'll be many other effects. Droughts will become more severe as well as higher temperatures. That is important here in Mexico City because Mexico City is already sensitive to a drought of water. This was a graph that I got from the New York Times, but it happens to be in Spanish, the only one I have in Spanish. But as you know, Mexico City, the Aztecs knew what they were doing, but when the Spanish took over, they screwed it up. And the city is going down because the water table is being used. Because you have so many people and a limited amount of water, there are parts of Mexico City that are shrinking 23 centimeters per year. And that has an impact. You can see it. For example, when you look at buildings and you have a water table, and then you reduce that water table, then the buildings on the volcanic soil begin to be affected, and you can see that. Here's a street in Mexico City. You can see the impact already. So this, as one of the people involved in sustainability in Mexico City has said, climate change will probably be the major challenge that this city has to face in the coming century. But it's worse than that. There are global effects of climate change that have nothing to do with these physical aspects. A Columbia University report found that when rainfall declines, the risk of a low-level conflict escalating to a full-scale civil war approximately doubles in the following year. This is also not hypothetical. We saw this happen, and it affected all of us. In Syria, there was an extended drought. What happened? Farmers could not farm the soil. They moved to the city, putting pressures on the city and exacerbating, and most people say, leading ultimately to the Syrian civil war. The Syrian civil war, of course, has had global consequences, the rise of ISIS affecting many people around the world. No place is an island when it comes to climate change. And that same effect will impact on Mexico. We've heard about the wall. Here are some pictures of an existing wall and some hypothetical wall that will never be built. We hope. But like most things Donald Trump says, it has nothing to do with reality. The same people in my country who want to build a wall to enclose the population and worry about immigrants are the same people that deny the existence of climate change. But that is hypocritical, because it's estimated that by 2050, there'll be 200 to 500 million people around the world displaced by climate change. But locally, that's even more important. Mexico, by comparison to the United States, is a much more agrarian economy. About 13% of the populace in Mexico are farmers, less than 1% in the United States. The effects of climate change will be dramatic in Mexico, far more dramatic. And according to one estimate, by 2080, the declines due to climate change will drive between 1.4 million and 6.7 million adult Mexicans out of the country. Another study said as many as 12 million Mexicans could try to emigrate north. So if you're worried about immigration, you should be worried about climate change in the United States, but that isn't happening. But that's something that we have to try and convince people in the United States, in the administration. The people who really care about these things already know about this. The Pentagon Office of Net Assessment already looked at the abrupt implications of climate change, and they said the United States and Australia are likely to build defensive fortresses around their countries because they have the resources and the reserves to achieve self-sufficiency. And if you go down to the end, borders will be strengthened around the country to hold back unwanted starving immigrants from the Caribbean islands, Mexico, and South America. This is an issue Mexico needs to bring up with the United States. Now, to conclude, there's another Mexican expression I've heard, which is, poor Mexico, so close to the United States, so far from God. Now, I'm an atheist, but the expression is important. What I'm showing you here is the fact that my parents used to own a small store, and I remember there was a sign on the store. It said, if you break it, it's yours. The industrial countries of the world, the United States in particular, and North America, have produced most of the carbon dioxide that's now in the atmosphere. The obligation we have is to fix it. And Mexico, because of the remarkable connections you have in the United States and your sensitivity to climate change, need to do everything you can to try and help the United States change its policies. Through your negotiations in NAFTA, to negotiations of a ridiculous wall, to the public demand for change. Because as we'll talk about, the movements that have really mattered in the 20th century have come from you, not from governments. The public needs to be energized if politicians are going to act. Politicians lead from behind, not from the front. And therefore the public needs to be informed, which is the reason we're having events like this, and you need to speak out. And so Mexico, by being next to the United States, may be far from God. Maybe they can't help the United States move closer to God, but maybe you can help the United States move closer to civilization. And that's what we'll talk about today. Thank you. Yeah. Wait, actually, you can hold this. Our first speaker today is probably known to many of you, Mario Molina. Mario was a student here and earned his undergraduate degree here, in fact, in chemical engineering. And I learned that I've asked each of our speakers where they got interested in what they were doing. He got interested when he was 10 years old in reading biographies of scientists, which actually is very much the same reason I was interested in science. You will know that Mario won the Nobel Prize for his work on chlorofluorocarbons and the ozone layer. I'm particularly proud to be on stage with Mario because I know many Nobel Prize winners, but very few of them have actually saved many lives. But Mario has, and I salute him for that. Obviously, from the work he did, the foundational work, very early on,
por su papel en la elucidación de la amenaza a la capa de ozono. Yo conozco a varias personas que han ganado el premio Nobel, pero pocos han salvado vidas, como Mario, pero Mario lo ha hecho, y por eso lo felicito. Obviamente, a partir de su labor, esos cimientos que fundó, después de especificar la amenaza de la capa de ozono de los clorofluorocarbonos de la Tierra, cambió las políticas de varios países del mundo y del mundo entero para comprobar que es posible. Mario obviamente ha tomado interés en estos temas ya por mucho tiempo y de hecho ha regresado. Obviamente, México, a partir de su labor, dirige el Centro esos cimientos que fundó. Trata de identificar soluciones a los retos relacionados con la amenaza de la capa de ozono de los globos. It is an honor to have a conversation with you. Talk for a little while because, as you know, this is a forum, and we'll have a debate among us. But I've been given a couple of minutes to introduce myself, so to speak. So I'll talk about a bit of climate change, science, and politics, but I'll do this briefly. First of all, I would like to confirm if the translation is working. It is an honor to have a conversation with you. I think you get my point, right? And we'll have a debate. Despite the fact that I'm a scientist, I'm making myself giving a couple of minutes. So briefly, let me explain some myths about climate change. A bit in particular. The first politics, but I'll do this briefly. Many politicians use specifically in the state that actually this is a climate change stories and we're conversation with you. Some scientists think it might be right? And don't spite of the fact that I'm a scientist, I'm making myself so well, it turns out that more than 5 years about climate change, very serious, many surveys were published in peer-reviewed journals that state that actually this asking scientists about some scientists interview scientists that study climate change, and the result has been astonishing. More than 97% of the respondents and published in the field of climate change, all of them agree that yes, climate change is a reality because long ago there was a big doubt about climate change, and secondly, it is very likely that all of these changes are originated by our own societies. So the question is, who's that 3%? Well, that 3% of the ones who disagree, as I said it 5 years ago, so the evidence has accumulated to such a degree that we are aware of their doubts, their stands, with great detail. It's not that we have ignored them. We have had a thorough discussion. This is a unique situation in science that we have such an extraordinary consensus. So 3%. That there are uncertainties, that's a myth, I should say. There are no uncertainties. And just to make sure, I'm going to use 1 more minute to explain, and I'll do it very briefly. What does the science say about climate? Well, back in the 19th century, scientists were quite concerned of the most adequate temperature for our planet, and it turns out that after measuring the temperature, how much energy comes from the sun and how much energy bodies emit, the conclusion that was reached was that the temperature of our planet should be under 18 degrees centigrade. And so we wouldn't be here because that would make our planet ice cold. But then they realized that we have an atmosphere. It's like the peel of an apple, but it's like a coat that our planet uses to increase this temperature from minus 18, which is what physicists have decided to, and it goes back to 15 degrees Celsius. So we have 32 degrees Celsius or centigrades in difference due to the coat, due to that cover that the planet has. And that is the greenhouse effect. And it comes naturally. And this was agreed already 100 years ago. So that piece of our science is as clear as water. But if our atmosphere was only oxygen and nitrogen, which is more than 93%, well, the planet would be minus 18 degrees centigrade. So what happens is that there are very tiny amounts of specific gases, and you just heard it from our moderator. The most important one is carbon dioxide, the world's thermostat. And there are so small particles that are measured in ppms. And you see it in one of the charts. How much has it increased? And if you see it in a 10,000 years, 280 ppms. And in the last 50 years, last 100 years, it increases more than 40%. It's a tremendous increase. And actually, our president, Dr. Rao, mentioned it. In 600,000 years or 800,000 years. But it's more than 3 million years that carbon dioxide has not shown such levels. And in the last 50 years, why are we getting those figures? It started with the Industrial Revolution by using fossil fuels, but it happened in the second half of last century. But if you identify what happens with temperature is similar. There were ice ages, but in the last 10,000 years, it's been very constant. And the last 8,000 years, we've seen a decrease. And if we wait another 30 or 4,000 years, we would see another ice age. But before that, temperature trips 1 degree, which is not that much. But in order to be the average of the planet, well, this is unprecedented in the last 10,000 years, for sure. So the scientific consensus is there. These two issues are connected. The change in the chemical composition of the atmosphere, one of the gases that appears in small concentrations to control. Water vapor is another topic that I won't have time to explain, but it's carbon dioxide and temperature. But scientists are very cautious, so they said, of course, these are connected, but we're not sure, because there's an uncertainty. Climate is a complex system. So the latest, and I'm not going to give you the full details of this story because scientists have agreed, because we haven't seen any detailed research yet, but 95% of probabilities is out there that change in temperature is caused by human activities, by using fossil fuels. Could it be a coincidence? I don't know. I'm not going to dare to say that 95% of us are on that side. Second myth. Don't worry. Don't worry. This will come at the end of the century. Your children, your grandchildren should care about that. Why should I care? Oh, no. The climate is changing. So this idea appears that way because carbon dioxide prevails in the atmosphere. Half is absorbed by the oceans, and another portion remains there, more than 1,000 years. So what we're doing is going to have a longer impact, but we're seeing the impact of it, and we've seen it this year, particularly with all the hurricanes that hit the Caribbean, and scientists are very careful. We are not sure what caused that, and it's not that climate change is creating extreme climate events, but what it does is increase its intensity, and that is very clear. So this 2 or 3 degrees, well, 2 or 3 more degrees that we see in the Caribbean, rising temperature of the oceans, this is what caused such intense hurricanes that we haven't seen in hundreds of years. So we are seeing the impact. It's not only something that will happen by the end of the year. And the third myth is that imagine that it happens, that we are causing climate change with our fossil fuel activities. But this society is not taking care of that. People think that, well, we would have to suck it up, and that is a myth, because we can use renewable energies that are competitive from a price point of view vis-a-vis fossil fuels. So that's not true. If we use our ingenuity and creativity, what we can do is to have extraordinary economic progress, yes, but with a sustainable planet in our hands without having to dare for climate change. And let me wrap up with risks. We can't predict with certainty what will happen by the end of the century because climate is, yes, complex, but we can use probabilities just as we use probabilities with extreme climate events. And I should say that would be wildfires, like the ones that happen in California, or heat waves. Many people die, specifically in Asia. But what I'm trying to say is that there is a risk. What we have seen, a group of scientists working together with economists, is to evaluate risk. What kind of risk do we have in front of us if we do what President Trump says? Oh, forget it. This is just a farce because the Chinese people want to go ahead of us and be at the forefront, and we are stupid. We should be stupid. All Nobel Prizes of the world, all science academies, all the professional associations, we should be idiots, right? We must be stupid. And, well, that's a different point of view. But what is the actual risk? Actually, what scientists do is to calculate the probabilities of the temperature by the end of the century rises. Well, what's the probability that it goes up 2 or 3 degrees? But more importantly, what is the probability that it rises more than 5 or 6 degrees? And just picture this. This is very important. Science is not telling us what to do. Science is telling us if you don't do nothing, well, it's going to go up, and these are the probabilities. But if the emissions go down, it might go up less than 2 degrees, provided you do this and that. So science is not good or bad. Is our society, with its own values, values of the scientific community, that everybody increases its standard of living. But it's not what science specifies. Those are our own judgments. But that is the risk. The probability that we have a more than 5 degrees increases 4 to 1. But if we see an increase of more than 5 degrees in our planet, we would have inhabitable locations where people during the summer would die. If they step out from their houses, we would have gigantic proportions in terms of migration, droughts, tremendous storms. That would be a tragedy, a tremendous tragedy, that the temperature would increase more than 5 degrees. And that is why that we use that probability 1 to 5. It would be extraordinarily irresponsible like President Trump. If he wants to be an ignorant, is highly irresponsible to do something for the future and the future generations, their children, their grandchildren, with a risk of 1 to 5. In this hall, imagine that someone came to say, oh, don't worry, there's a 1 to 10 probability of an earthquake, and the building might fall, probably. Or if you ride a plane, the risks measure 1 to 100,000 or 1 to 1,000,000 probability of the pilot said, an engine broke, doesn't matter. There's 1 to 10 probabilities that we don't get to our destination. So it's highly irresponsible, and that is what I have to say. The building might fall, probably. Or if you ride a plane, the risks measure 1 to 100,000 or 1 to 1,000,000 probability of the pilot said, an engine broke, doesn't matter. There's 1 to 10 probabilities that we don't get to our destination. So it's highly irresponsible, and that is what I have to say. The building might fall, probably.
I was interested to discover that his activity was not recent, that he got a book about weather when he was 10 years old.
Muchas gracias.
Built all sorts of things.
Muchas gracias por fijar el contexto de la necesidad de acción y de actuar responsablemente. Son cosas tan importantes. Ahora, nuestro siguiente ponente escrito es meteorólogo teórico en cuestiones del clima, profesor emérito distinguido en la Scripps Institution. Y entonces Richard acaba de escribir, escribió un libro cuando tenía 10 años y allá se puso a construir equipo para estudiar el clima y lo ha estado haciendo desde que tenía 10 años. Tiene un doctorado en meteorología de la Universidad de California. Desde hace muchos años ha estudiado el cambio climático, particularmente un efecto muy importante que es la cobertura de nubes. Y ha hecho simulacros para entender las nubes, cómo es que las nubes cambian y cómo afectan el cambio climático desde que tenía 10 años. Modelos Richard se hace los modelos con la tecnología, entonces está cubierta de peligro, especialmente es lo que le estudia. Es un jugador importantísimo de la comunidad científica para estudiar. Es el autor coordinador titular del informe sobre el panel Las Nubes como gubernamental y se compartió el premio Nobel con Al Gore allá en 1997. Estoy con Richard porque he tenido el privilegio de trabajar con él en algo que se llama el Boletín del Científico Atómico. Con gusto comparto el consejo con él y nosotros tenemos ese reloj del juicio final. Esto es algo que hace muy divertido, el reloj del juicio final. En enero el 25 de enero hace el premio el cambio climático en los hallazgos existenciales para estudiar científicos para que nos asesoraban. Richard, los expertos, he disfrutado y aprendido tanto de mi gusto, años de trabajo. Qué gusto que estás con nosotros. Tienes la palabra, por favor. Juicio final. Esto es algo que hace muy divertido, el reloj del juicio final. En enero del 25 de Gracias. El premio el cambio climático en los hallazgos existenciales para estudiar. La ciencia climática es como la ciencia médica. Ninguna es perfecta. Pero ambas son muy útiles. Y te voy a ayudar un poco, déjame ver, ya creo que te oyen mejor. Un momentito, hablen entre ustedes, platiquen entre el público, por favor, mientras yo hago esta operación acá, bastante delicada. A ver, ¿ya funciona? ¿Sí? ¿Me oyen bien? Sí. Muy bien, adelante. Y para predecir cuán severo será el cambio climático en las décadas por venir. Y el desconocido, más importante, no es la incertidumbre científica, sino lo más desconocido por mucho es la conducta humana. Es decir, las personas hablen entre ustedes, platican colectivamente, decidir mientras yo hago esta operación acá, bastante delicada. Cambio climático hecho por el hombro. ¿Me oyen por el hombre? Esto muy bien, tenemos que cumplir con las metas. Y para predecir cuán severo será el calentamiento global, depende principalmente de estos gases que atrapan el calor, como el dióxido de carbono y muchísimo. Hoy, porque las actividades humanas han cambiado la atmósfera, entonces se atrapa más en las décadas. Entonces, más energía del climático por el hombro debes hacer. No hay un equilibrio en todo esto. Como resultado de esto, el sistema climático está ganando calor y el mundo se está calentando. Estamos muy seguros de todo esto. La ciencia no puede especificar el nivel de cambio climático que sea peligroso. Esta es una cuestión en donde tenemos que ver tolerancia, valores, prioridades políticas y otras cuestiones. Y al aumentar el calentamiento, sin embargo, todos los riesgos también aumentan. Hoy por hoy, casi todo el mundo ha aceptado la meta de limitar el calentamiento global a 2 grados Celsius, 1.6 en Fahrenheit para aquellos que viven en Estados Unidos, por encima de las temperaturas preindustriales de los 1700. No hay nada mágico de este objetivo, es como el colesterol, no hay un colesterol mágico sobre el cual uno va a tener un infarto y otro en el que uno vivirá eternamente, ¿verdad? Pero este es el corazón de limitar el 15 de París y todos los gobiernos firmaron este acuerdo. No será fácil lograr esta meta. Algunas personas piensan, de hecho, que la mente será imposible. Yo no quiero colocar muchos énfasis en esta meta de 2 grados de objetivo. Algunos gobiernos preferirían incluso una meta más ambiciosa como 1,5 grados Celsius. Otros prefieren otro objetivo, prefieren que no haya ningún objetivo, ninguna meta. Pero el hecho de las cosas es que los gobiernos decidieron que fueran 2 grados como cada nación en el mundo, algunas cosas de París. Ahora bien, dado cualquier objetivo específico como el 2 grados Celsius como meta para el calentamiento, la ciencia de los gobiernos puede influir en las tomas de decisiones para ver qué tipo de situaciones son necesarias para cumplir con esta meta. La investigación demuestra que las proyecciones científicas del pasado no han hablado tanto sobre esto, en algunos sentidos cada subestimaron los impactos. Los resultados incluyen medidas que incluyen en las capas de hielo en Antártida y Groenlandia que se están reduciendo en las tomas de decisiones. La masa se está reduciendo y el nivel de emisiones se está elevando. Un mundo más caliente inevitablemente tiene niveles de más mucho más elevados por 2 razones. Es decir, que al expandirse el agua, porque le aumenta la temperatura y también el hielo sobre la tierra que se derrite y va fluyendo. al menos que la humanidad actúe rápida y decididamente para reducir estas emisiones de gases que atrapan el calor, que el aumento en el nivel del mar puede exceder 1 metro para 2 veces esa cantidad o incluso más, es decir, como posible. Al aumentar el nivel del mar, pues esto no se va a detener en 2100, sino que continuará. Este nivel de aumento llevará al abandono de especies costeras y cambiará literalmente el mapa del mundo. Nosotros que estamos vivos hoy tenemos las manos en un termostato que controla el clima, más que nuestros hijos y nietos al menos que estas emisiones se reduzcan dramáticamente y rápidamente. Entonces, después de muchos años, el mundo ya no tendrá una oportunidad de limitar este calentamiento 2 grados Celsius por encima de las temperaturas preindustriales. Entonces, las emisiones deben hacer un pico, pero luego deben empezar a caer rápidamente en los próximos años. Estas temperaturas deben llegar a cero bien dentro de este siglo. Estamos hablando entonces de que rápidamente de la necesidad de combustibles fósiles, estos de limitar gases que atrapan el calor son los gases de efecto invernadero, pero son la fuente principal. Estamos hablando de un 60% más de estos deben empezar a caer rápidamente. 290 para limitar el cambio climático. Las emisiones deben también disminuirse marcadamente. La física y la química del sistema climatológico obedecen estas leyes naturales. Los científicos que atrapan el calor hemos aprendido que el efecto invernadero depende de dióxido de carbono. Entonces, en la atmósfera que sigue en la atmósfera y se queda mucho tiempo, durante siglos en la atmósfera. Las emisiones acumulativas son las que importan del CO2. Y nuestro entendimiento científico nos dice la química que 7.6 mil millones de personas vivas en el mundo son responsables del cambio climático en las décadas por venir. Estos son cambios que nosotros debemos decidir y esto determinará que sigue en la atmósfera y seguirá para las futuras generaciones. Su mundo está en nuestras relativas. Entonces, una vez que los gobiernos hayan su entendimiento a la meta como de 2 grados Celsius, que ya mencioné, entonces el caso de la urgencia y para tomar medidas significativas para reducir las emisiones se basa en décadas en investigación científica muy robusta que nosotros debemos entonces la lógica, el raciocinio para esta acción decisiva no es que su mundo esté en nuestras relativas, sino que es una vez físicamente tiene fundamentos. Si el mundo continúa avanzando a través después del 2020 para que las emisiones de gases que atrapan el calor y continúan estas reducciones durante 10 o más años, entonces casi ciertamente habremos perdido la oportunidad de limitar el calentamiento global a 2 grados Celsius. En ese caso, señoras y señores, nuestro fracaso para tomar estas medidas urgentes para reducir las emisiones, nosotros que si el mundo continúa, habremos sentenciado a nuestros hijos y nietos que tengan emisiones de gases que atrapan el calor, disrupciones climáticas más severas y ellos quizás ni siquiera puedan resolver el problema que nosotros ciertamente habremos perdido. Por tanto, de enfrentar el reto del cambio climático finalmente no es una cuestión de ciencia, sociología y política. Finalmente se trata de un asunto moral y ético. Muchas gracias. Habremos sentenciado a nuestros hijos y nietos que tengan emisiones de gases.
Muchas gracias, Richard. Gracias, Richard.
Ellos quizás ni siquiera puedan resolver el problema que nosotros.
Muchas gracias por señalar las bases científicas
y las bases
morales que hay veces que no las vemos. Me da mucho gusto presentarles ahora al profesor Dan Schrag, quien es uno de los geólogos más preeminentes y científicos ambientales en los Estados Unidos, si no es que del mundo entero. Él es profesor de Ciencias Ambientales y de Geología e Ingeniería de la Universidad de Harvard y director del Centro de Harvard para el Medio Ambiente. y también
That's
codirige.
wrong because he applies laws of physics as well as anyone in the world.
Con John Holder, el asesor en cuanto al ambiente al presidente Obama, en la escuela Kennedy, copreside un programa.
ambientales en los Estados Unidos y más que del mundo.
Él, su licenciatura fue una licenciatura conjunta de Geología y Ciencias Políticas, que parece un oxímoron, ¿verdad? Es decir, pero yo le pregunté por qué, y por qué no me dejaron entrar a física. Pero eso estuvo mal, porque aplica las leyes de la física también como cualquier persona del mundo para entender el clima. Y cuando conocí a Dan, bueno, éramos más jóvenes los dos, pero él era más joven que yo. Como un joven profesor que era, acababa de demostrar algo muy profundo y revolucionario. En un periodo, 600,000 días atrás, la Tierra era como una bola de nieve. Esta idea era controversial, pero ya lo entendemos ahora. Tiene gran experiencia al entender el clima global. ¿Y por qué Dan es único? Porque trabaja con distintas escalas de tiempo, el pasado, el presente y el futuro. Y de eso hablará él. Dan, por favor, muchísimas gracias. Días atrás, la Tierra era como una bola de nieve. Gracias a todos ustedes por venir a escucharnos. Y quiero secundar a lo que Mario y Richard les han compartido. Pero también quisiera abonar soluciones con distintas escalas de tiempo, el pasado, el presente. Primero que nada, quisiera hablar de las escalas de tiempo del cambio climático. Muchísimas gracias. De alguna manera, se le llama el cambio climático es uno de los problemas más acuciantes de nuestro tiempo. Gracias a todos ustedes por venir a escuchar. Y es cierto, sí, es un problema urgente, pero de alguna manera, la razón por la que el cambio climático es un problema tan difícil es que nunca ha sido urgente. Las escalas de tiempo del cambio climático, voy a hablar de lo que son en un minuto más, son muy largas. Y eso quiere decir que siempre hay algo que se vuelve más presente e importante. Incluso cuando sucede un desastre que tiene que ver con el clima y destruye tu ciudad, tu poblado, tu hogar, uno no se pone a pensar, ay, me hubiera gustado, no sé, ya no voy a utilizar combustibles fósiles. No piensa de esa manera. Es por eso que es tan difícil. Son muy largas. Ahora, como les dije, hay distintas escalas de tiempo relacionadas con el cambio climático. Voy a utilizar nada más 3. Primero que nada, el ciclo del carbono y su escala de tiempo. Y Morris habló de esto ya, pero quisiera poner las cosas en perspectiva. La mitad del dióxido de carbono que quemamos de combustibles fósiles se queda, la mitad, un cuarto en los océanos, un cuarto en los árboles, ahora como les dije, en el aire. Pero de esa mitad que se queda en la atmósfera, voy a utilizar nada más 3. Aproximadamente un tercio de lo que se queda ahí va a quedarse aquí 20,000 años a partir de esto. 20,000 años. La mitad si comparamos al desecho nuclear de combustibles de alto nivel, en 100 años un cuarto en los océanos, un 1% va a perdurar. Entonces, va a durar más el dióxido de carbono. Pídelo de esa manera. Estamos tomando acciones hoy. Vamos a decidir hoy, no nada más algo que va a afectar a tus hijos y a tus nietos, sino a generaciones venideras, miles de generaciones. Si comparamos, estamos decidiendo el mundo en el que van a vivir alto nivel. Por supuesto que sí, estamos hablando de sistemas de clima que tienen distintas escalas de tiempo, las escalas de tiempo de los mares, la relación con la temperatura, las placas de hielo y cómo se están derritiendo poco a poco, esperemos que sea poco a poco. Pero todas estas escalas de tiempo rigen el sistema de energía del mundo. Es por eso que son importantes y por eso las elegí como el tema de hoy. Esta es una gráfica que muestra la historia de la energía del mundo en los últimos 200 años. Como pueden ver, hace 200 años el mundo utilizaba de la biomasa su energía, principalmente de la leña. Y como pueden ver aquí en la revolución industrial que inició de alguna manera con la invención del motor a vapor, el sistema de energía del 1867, pero tomó casi 150 años para que el carbón tomara el lugar de la leña como energía preponderante. Pero vemos aquí en los últimos 100 años cómo el carbón, el petróleo y el gas se usan más ¿Por qué? Porque han transformado nuestro mundo. De hecho, podríamos dedicarle toda la velada a hablar de esta diapositiva, porque es la historia del mundo en una gráfica. Todas las maravillas de nuestra vida, por ejemplo, la mortalidad infantil, la esperanza de vida, todo eso tiene que ver con tener acceso a energías más baratas, pero el lado oscuro es la acumulación de los productos secundarios de quemar combustibles fósiles. Eso quiere decir que ahora el clima está cambiando. Hablar de esta diapositiva. Desafortunadamente, la escala de tiempo del sistema de maravillas se extiende durante la última década. Por ejemplo, he trabajado con colegas y alumnos para tratar de entender cómo es que llegamos a un sistema de esperanza de poco carbono. Y de hecho es sumamente difícil. La escala de tiempo, desafortunadamente, es mucho más extensa de la acumulación. Estamos hablando de reconstruir la infraestructura que conforma los cimientos de nuestro estilo de vida moderno. La gente no va a dejar de usar el auto, no van a dejar así de tajo de usar calefacción o utilizar en el verano aire acondicionado. Esto no va a ser así. Y de hecho tenemos a miles de millones de personas en el mundo que están en la pobreza, que rápidamente, y esperemos que a paso vertiginoso tengan los cimientos de riqueza y tengan un estilo muy parecido al de nosotros. Y eso también es una prioridad, es un imperativo moral. Dejar así es que desafortunadamente la escala del proyecto que tenemos frente a nosotros pinta de alguna manera una escala de tiempo muy extensa. Me parece que el reto que enfrentamos hoy por hoy es cómo aceleramos esa escala de tiempo. Realmente esa es la esencia que tenemos frente a nosotros. Quiero mostrarles esta caricatura, me encanta, pero de hecho es un poco sombría. Muestra la industria energética del estado en donde vivo, Massachusetts. Hace 200 años cazaban ballenas. Y aquí se muestra a las ballenas en un festín por el descubrimiento del petróleo en 1861. Y es cierto, de alguna manera por eso es cómico, pero de hecho dejamos de cazar ballenas porque creo que se descubrió el petróleo. Ahora, voy a dejar las cosas bien en claro. Me preocupo por las ballenas, de verdad, pero no es por eso que dejamos de cazar. Hoy, no el promedio.
But I think the important point is that it's never too late to do something about it. One of my worries is that if we cross the 2-degree threshold, and frankly I think that's very, very likely, that people will throw up their hands and say, it's over. We're all done. The world's over. We may as well just enjoy. And that's not true. What we do know about the science says that 2 degrees is much worse than 1 degree. 3 degrees is much, much worse than 2 degrees. And 4 degrees is much, much, much worse than 3 degrees. And so it's never too late to actually do something. We have to work as hard as we can, and ultimately technology will be a big part of the solution. But it is more than technology. And here are a couple of quotes from H.G. Wells and from Charles Darwin that focus on adaptation, but ultimately on human ingenuity. Humans are incredibly creative. We have done amazing things as a species. Not all good, but incredible. Especially when we are pushed with necessity. And I think, in some ways, the bright side of this is that we may be perched on the edge of a century of innovation and creativity and human ingenuity, the likes of which we have never seen in the history of the world. And it will be partly driven by climate change. Are we on a verge of the new age of innovation? And I'm not just talking about energy. Yes, we need to innovate in energy. We need to make wind and solar cheaper. We need to make better batteries. We need to have electric vehicles. We need to have perhaps biofuels for jet fuel. We need all sorts of new types of technologies and figure out ways of making them better and cheaper. But there's also innovation in architecture. You can imagine, in response to climate change, people's buildings will change, how we actually live our lives. Agriculture, how we grow our food, will ultimately have to change. And humans are incredibly creative in the way they adapt. Farmers are not stupid. They're very, very smart. And they will figure out new ways of growing food in the most interesting and creative ways. Conservation, how we actually treat nature. We are stewards of the natural world, and we need to think about how we're going to take care of that. Transportation, of course. And finally, our system of government. Climate change calls for a type of global governance that really hasn't been a major part of the discussion since the end of World War II. This is almost a new call for a question of global order and control, and it'll be very interesting to see how this conversation over the coming decades evolves. But I suspect in 30 years it will look different than it does today. I want to end just with this one quote that I hope raises some interesting thoughts. This is from a friend of mine who's a professor at the University of Michigan, Andy Hoffman. And he says, just as few people saw a moral problem with slavery in the 18th century, to be clear, there were abolitionists there, but it wasn't the dominant thinking in the US and England. Few people in the 21st century see a moral problem with the burning of fossil fuels. Will people in 100 years look at us with the same incomprehension we feel towards 18th century defenders of slavery? If we are to address the problem adequately, the answer to that question must be yes. Our common atmosphere will no longer be seen as a free dumping ground for greenhouse gases and other pollutants. I think this is a really interesting perspective. And I think to me it raises the question of how the moral framing of climate change is partly driven by technology and by opportunity. What is the relationship between technology, economics, and social and political attitudes, and how will our perception of climate change depend on how we develop new technologies? For example, my suspicion is that if we actually had tomorrow a magical new technology that produced carbon-free energy very cheaply, suddenly we would all look back at those people who burned coal and burned oil with huge disdain. So how will the attitudes towards climate change shift as our experience of climate grows? This to me is one of the most interesting things to watch and worthy of further conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. Thank you. That, as I hope, that was a perfect beginning of a segue. One of the things we try and do in these events with the Origins Project is not just talk about problems, but talk about solutions, because that's much more important. And we need to talk about them. And while Dan talked about the importance of innovation, he began to set the stage for another aspect, which Richard alluded to, and Mario. This is a human problem. It's not just a technological problem. And to solve it will require technology, but also human systems to come together, human economic systems, and ultimately social systems. And that allows us to move to our next speaker, who is one of the panelists that I just met, but she's delightful.
Thank you.
Alicia Bárcena serves as the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean of the United Nations. Alicia, I found out, well, she began life as a burgeoning scientist, as a biologist. Her father got her interested in science, I found out, and he was interested in physics. And she entered university and saw a line and chose biology. Yet another lost physicist, but that's okay. She moved then on to ecology and economics and moved into the diplomatic arena, which is so important as we think of global activities. And she's worked in that way. She was Undersecretary General for Management at the United Nations headquarters in New York. And she's been founding director of the Earth Council in Costa Rica, a non-governmental organization in charge of follow-up on agreements on the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. She has been trying to implement in a diplomatic area between governments the question of how we can equitably and produce a sustainable world. And I'm very pleased to introduce her now. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. In reality, aside from being a biologist that went to the world of politics, I'm the only woman in this panel. Yes. So, right? Am I right or not? And I dressed in red so that they would go with Larry's tennis shoes. Yes, very important, right? What I wanted to show you today is the fact that I think the only solution we have is multilateralism that works for people. But how are we going from where we are right now to multilateralism? We are not in times of changes. We are in a change of times because we have tectonic changes of impressive magnitude. Migration, for instance, 244 million people live outside their place of origin. 30 million Latin Americans, 20 of which live in the United States. 11 million are illegal in the United States, and I don't know how much or how many more will continue migrating. We have climate change. According to our view, this is the major flaw of the market. Climate change doesn't really recognize barriers, walls, borders, or anything else. That's why from wall to wall, climate change does not recognize any of those ones. And we are facing major geopolitical changes where we see China, for instance, building bridges and Trump building walls. A world that we never imagined we would ever see even less than a year ago. And we are in a crisis of development models that were betting on free trade as the only way out, the only neoliberal solution of our development. And this model is now going through a crisis. We are right in the middle of a model that does not work. And we have a fourth industrial revolution with biotechnology, nanotechnology, and digital technology, innovation. Yes, I hope that is the solution. But the new gaps are being opened through technology. We don't know what will happen with the future of labor force and jobs. What are we seeing today? We're going through a very strange phases of hyperglobalization in which world trade is not growing so much, in which there's a fragmented world of a system of fragmented trade with growing protectionism. This is something we've been talking about with great uncertainty as well. And also with a tremendous situation in which, for instance, China, they criticized, they said we would, for substituting imports. Well, China is doing exactly that and breaking the chains of global value. And so everything is being challenged, and we have multilateralism that doesn't work, financial rules don't work, and we don't have systems that are truly global that will help us close great asymmetries. And it's not that we don't have money. I mean, there's a lot of money all over. What happens is that this liquidity is concentrated in just a few hands and in financial assets and derivatives that are 10 times more points in the GDP of derivatives and 4 times more in derivatives and also financial assets, those international finances that sometimes we do not understand. And today, the problem of fiscal havens that we've proclaimed so much, that we've been talking about Latin America and the Caribbean, there we have $340 million of fiscal evasion. That is called the culture of the privileges. That is an elite that decides not to pay taxes so as not to have public goods that are global or regionally or national, and they send them to this fiscal paradise or havens. It is true that globalization helped us take a lot of people from poverty. In China, 600 million people are now out of poverty. In Latin America, we've been able to take people from extreme poverty, many people, but inequality is killing us because 1% of humankind, 1% of humankind has the income, half of the income of the rest of the population. This is only to talk about income, 1%, and the world has has increased its amount of income in a very important fashion, but even then, wealth is concentrated in just a few hands. And I was talking to Professor Chomsky was saying something very interesting this morning. Why is it that Trump is so popular? Why did he win the presidency? What is happening in Europe? Well, what happens is that there's a middle class, which is the one that feels like the great loser, the big loser of all this. This is in this middle class of the developed countries. They feel they've lost. They're the big losers of globalization. And they feel that there's no mobility, no class mobility, and Trump represents them, and the future generations are going to be worse off than they are now. And they're the ones that are really betting and supporting protectionism and economic nationalism. On the other hand, we have which are the middle classes of China, India, and the emerging countries that are like the big winners of globalization. And of course, yes, well, this is the curve of the trunk of the elephant, right? At the tip of the trunk, we have precisely that one winning percent, the great winner of them all. And by the way, just recently a report was disclosed showing that 8 individuals, this is an Oxfam, have the wealth of 3.5 billion people. And those 8 individuals, 6 of them belong to the great corporations of technology, Amazon, Oracle, Facebook, Google. So they are the ones that are winning. They are the ones that are doing all the lobbying so as not to be able to reach goals as controlling climate change. So this is the corporations, this is what they're doing. And there's lobbyists, and this is what they've told us, the experts on climate change. Look what is happening to our children and grandchildren in the future. Our grandchildren, for instance, if this is what will happen to them, we don't do anything, we're going to live in a world at 4 or 5 degrees in temperature. Am I right, Dr. Molina? This will be a fatal situation. We're not even going to be alive. We're not going to be there, but our grandchildren are going to be there, and our children as well. So that's where we're at. And it's true that the 2 degrees were set artificially. However, what is not artificially set is that we have just very little space in the quota of CO2 and the CO2 quota. And I'm not an expert on this like you are, but the truth is that we only have that very small blue boundary or limit on the graph here, and we've already used all the carbon budget, and that's where the problem lies for humanity and for our region. And I find it lamentable to say this, that this is the most important thing for a region is adaptation, because our region only causes 12% of all greenhouse effect gases. This doesn't mean we're now going to be using fossil fuels, because this is just a low percentage, but the reality of things is that the impact of climate change is also asymmetric. It is true that it doesn't recognize any boundaries or borders, and the carbon is up there, but the impact, it is unequal. The impact is stronger in the Caribbean, Central America, and the coast areas and the poorest areas of the world. It's also true that natural disasters, which are not a direct cause, but the intensity is a direct cause, and this intensity is costing $300 billion in Latin America, and the accumulated cost of natural disasters and the hurricane we just witnessed. Well, we've been witnessing just a migration of 1,700 homes from Barbuda. 1,700 families had to migrate from that island because of the recent disaster of Hurricane Maria and Irma. So then, Professor Chomsky, the title of your book is called Who Runs the World? That's the title of your book, Who Runs the World, and who will be dominating in the world. If we don't do anything, then the world will be run by those that are leading technological revolution. Do we want those 8 people to continue leading the world with Amazon, Facebook, or Google? Or do we want to empower ourselves as citizens? China, The U.S. and Europe are already fighting with each other because of the control of patents and technological innovation and energy and biotechnology, nanotechnology. They're already fighting for that. But the owners of big data are the ones that have the control over people. I hope, Professor Chomsky, that you tell them about the case of Germany, how Facebook influenced the German elections just recently, 2 weeks ago in Germany. So then the elite or the people, that's the question. How do we change the development style? And he's already said, where are we right now? Where do we want to go? We need a new paradigm. The development style right now doesn't work. As clear as all that. Capitalism, I'm sorry, doesn't work the way it is. We need. And we're not afraid. We are not afraid of using a model, going to a model where we would have what I would have a progressive vision, a socialist vision, in which we believe truly that we need universal access to goods. We need the foundation of rights. We need, I think, equality, a profound equality, because inequality is a conspiration against development, against democracy. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, we do have to go to innovation, but with equality, with equity, with inclusion. We cannot just leave that up to the big elites of the world. And that is why I think multilateralism has to work. It has to work. Collective work has to work. We need global governance that will allow us to create global public goods, climate security, peace. That is why it is true that I'm a poor biologist that went to the United Nations to change the world. And I invite all of you, dear friends, let us change the world with the 2030 agenda in our hands, with innovation, with the participation of all citizens, youth, young people. We are all going to change the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. See, I told you she was delightful and inspiring. Well, the rest of us on the stage are under no illusion about why you're here. And let me now turn to my good friend, Noam Chomsky, who we will. You all know who Noam is. I won't spend a lot of time, but I will say I asked Noam why he got into linguistics. As many of you know, he essentially established modern linguistics. And he said he chose it because it was the course at university that had the fewest requirements and the fewest courses. I point this out because we're very aware that this is at a university and there are young people here, and we hope to guide you. He almost dropped out, he said, but he didn't, and we're all lucky he didn't. Because Noam not only changed the field of linguistics with his PhD thesis, which he did when he was a junior fellow at Harvard on transformational analysis, but became perhaps the most cited scholar in modern times. But that's not why you know him. And I want to just end my short introduction by saying it's always very personal for me to be able to be with Noam and introduce him, because he had a profound effect on me when I was a student at MIT, and not only did I take his course on American foreign policy, but I watched him lecture, and I said to myself, I want to grow up and be like Noam Chomsky. Now, I'm not, but the importance of being a scholar who cares about the world and takes that out to the world is what Noam has done. Became famous during the Vietnam War, and ever since then, and has become a role model not just for me, but for many people around the world, and is certainly one of the most remarkable people I've ever known, and I'm very happy to introduce Noam Chomsky.
Thank you very much. Thanks. There's no shortage of grim warnings about the consequences of our folly if we persist in our present course of fossil fuel use. You've heard about them from voices far more competent than I am to review them. I'll mention only one, which in fact was mentioned earlier. The last period when sea surface temperatures were approximately the way they are today was about 120,000 years ago. And the estimate is that the sea level at that time was about 6 to 9 meters higher than it is today. The U.S. government National Climate Assessment was just released a few days ago. It was, of course, dismissed by the Trump administration. It warned that sea level might rise by over 2 meters, even in this century, with possible rapid escalation from permafrost melting, other very severe dangers. We need not tarry on what anything remotely like those conditions would mean for organized human life. I don't have to comment on the current role of the most powerful country in world history. It's now confronting the entire world, stands totally alone in its determination to march forward to destroy the environment. And right now it is reveling in the fact, quote the business press, the fact that growth in U.S. oil output until 2025 will be the strongest seen by any country in the history of crude markets, making it the undisputed leader among global producers for decades to come. It's the report of the International Energy Agency yesterday. And we can add many more ongoing blows to the shared commons that sustains our survival, and indeed the survival of many other species that are disappearing rapidly under the 6th extinction now underway as a result of human actions, roughly comparable to the 5th extinction 65 million years ago, when it's generally assumed that an asteroid hit the Earth, ending the age of the dinosaurs, opening the way for small mammals, ultimately us. Now we're using our intelligence to become the asteroid that's carrying out the next extinction. With eyes open, we're creating what's sometimes called a tragedy of the commons, our common possession. The tragedy that we were constructing, it was in fact predicted. It's a very natural product of what Adam Smith described as the driving force of emerging capitalism. In his words, the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, all for ourselves, nothing for anyone else. That vile maxim is indeed the guiding principle of a capitalist market economy. A century after Adam Smith, in the early stage of the American Industrial Revolution, American workers gave their own version of the vile maxim. They deplored what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth, forgetting all but self. That's the vile maxim. They, like others who have been subjected to this brutal logic, first in England, then the United States, then many other countries. Like all of them, they bitterly resented being driven to subordinating themselves to the rule of the masters of the world, the masters of mankind, as part of a dehumanizing socioeconomic order in which each participant seeks to maximize individual gain while disregarding the effect on others of actions or transactions, what's called externalities in contemporary jargon. So, for example, when the Alaska reserves are thrown open for the first time for exploitation by energy corporations, as is happening right now under the Trump administration, we're witnessing another exercise of the vile maxim and the coming tragedy of the commons. We're witnessing it with brutal clarity. And the same is true when Mexico proudly announces, as it did very recently, that a 1 billion barrel crude discovery in the Gulf will be just the lure, quoting the business press, just the lure that Mexico needs to attract international oil majors to exploit its reserves and enrich themselves and drive us further to disaster. The driving principle of state capitalist institutions, our institutions, is pursuit of the vile maxim, disregard for the commons. It embodies a profound social pathology which has to be extirpated if organized human society is going to survive in any tolerable form. This pathology is not rooted in human nature. It's a recent phenomenon. As the historical record reveals, the new spirit of the age was imposed by considerable force. Very recently, first in England, later elsewhere, always resisted bitterly from the inception of the process until today. It's taken a long time to drive the new spirit of the age into people's minds so they accept the subordination to a dehumanized society and the rules of the masters. But it's very thin. Right beneath the surface, there's plenty of resistance. And you see it in the anger, resentment, fear that's growing over much of the world. And it's rather striking that traditional societies have typically nurtured the commons, taken care of it, ensuring that it survived. That was true working to preserve them. That was true of England right up to the time of the enclosure properties program, 17th and 18th century, that were the first step in privatization of the commons and implanting of capitalist institutions and ideology. Was imposed by considerable force, bitterly resisted from the earliest days and on. And much the same is true today when we see that traditional indigenous societies throughout the world are in the lead in trying to rescue us from our folly and preserve the commons on which we rely for survival. Sometimes we see that in dramatic ways. A few years ago, Ecuador, which has large indigenous population, actually offered to do what everyone ought to do, to leave a large portion of their oil reserves in the ground. They requested that the rich societies, the European societies, compensate them for a small portion of the gain that they were losing. And the European societies, of course, refused. They are mired in service to the vile maxim, just as we are. And the oil is now being produced. to preserve the commons on which we survive is certainly possible. We have the means to do so. You've heard many examples, plenty of technical, social possibilities to deal with it. There is a question. The question is whether we have the will to face fundamental questions about the institutions that we've constructed and about the values that guide our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Noam, and for setting the stage of the fact that, and this is maybe considered, as you said earlier, a moral question as much as a technical one. And what for those of you who wonder what's going to happen next is we'll have a discussion among the panel. I think there have been some questions submitted by students. If they don't get up to me before the end, we won't ask them. So I'll find out about that. But let me, there we go. But let me ask a few questions, and to all of you. First of all, I want to pick up on I guess, something that Dan talked about, which is, and you talked about too, in a sense, is aspirations, the aspirations of Paris versus reality. Is Paris a problem? Is putting a 2-degree goal a problem, or is it a motivation? So you probably think it's a problem. So let's start with you.
I think saying it's a problem is a little too simplistic.
Yes, whether
Okay.
Paris is an incentive.
I worry that it may become a
is an
problem.
incentive to change or not, the 2 degrees.
I think we have to make it very clear that 2 degrees is an aspiration. You know, it's a little bit like the story of the tortoise and the hare.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, Paris, in terms of what the aspirations were, and the 2-degree, or maybe even 1.5-degree rhetoric, that's the hare. The actions the commitments that were made were just a tiny down payment, the first maybe few steps of the race. I want to make sure that we have some tortoises in the race too, because I think it's important to finish the race and ultimately remove fossil fuels from our energy system, even if we don't make the 2-degree target, because, as I said, it's never over.
Okay. What about Mario? You were talking about. You've been talking about the fight in some sense, the distortion, the effect on Paris, and I'll get to obviously to you in a second, Richard, because you've been intimately involved in that. In terms of battling the public relations problem, which is as much of a battle as anything else, is Paris a help or a problem? What do you think?
No, in my view, Paris was a success story if you look at it historically. Start with the former protocols, the Kyoto Protocol, and so on. It took more than 20 years for the different countries finally to reach an agreement. However mild it was, we were working with President Obama, of course, so the Paris Agreement is molded in such a way that it does not require the Congress in the United States to approve it. That's the main reason why you cannot put the price on emissions. But let me use this opportunity. I think it's very important because it's in connection. Why do I think it's something very positive? And that's because I'm an optimist. We have one example of something that has worked extremely well, and that's precisely the other global problem that we had with stratospheric ozone. We are celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Montreal Protocol, and it worked. It's stopping the emission of compounds that were damaging the environment. Industry, initially, of course, we're fighting with them, but like many industries now with fossil fuels, they are willing to work with us. We can work together with the private sector, of course with academia as well, and solve the problem. That has been done already. and they just created new chemicals that would not affect ozone. And we already have that. We have new forms of energy that can work. So of course it's not easy, it's a humongous change, but we know it can be done. In fact, we, the scientific community, have been very poor at communicating with the public. And we want to start something much bigger to explain to the public this incredible risk that we're having. And we're planning to do that, but we want to work with you, the young people, so that we can make enough noise so that this actually works. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, and I'll applaud that. And of course, yes. And that's one of the reasons why we're here tonight, in fact, is just for that. But as someone who's been really intimately involved in some ways in this through the IPCC, what's your impression, Richard?
I was in Paris for the entire 2 weeks of the negotiations 2 years ago that led to the Paris Agreement, and I can remember the sense of accomplishment and joy and celebration that we had finally, the negotiators, had finally managed to break the log jam that had kept previous agreements from being acceptable. And to me, I think Paris is a newborn baby, and we don't know yet what its impact will be, because rather than impose limits on emissions of various countries, Paris asked every country to voluntarily submit its own pledge as to how it would reduce emissions, by what amount, by how long, and so on. And in fact, the pledges came in very different forms. They were apples and oranges comparisons. But nonetheless, the pledges were made. We'll see how well governments do at meeting their pledges. It's a promise, not an accomplishment. But at the same time, Paris provides a mechanism for governments to meet again every few years to assess progress, to decide what governments have accomplished, what achievements, and then to rely on new technology and progress in many spheres to make the targets more strict, to make the limitations on emissions more severe. And I think it's that mechanism that provides a way of achieving goals that are more than just baby steps, but that will lead to greater steps. You know, my own mother lived to 102. She saw the entire 20th century, and she always has cautioned me, don't think about solving tomorrow's problems with today's technology. When you think about the accomplishments technologically of the 20th century, everything from aircraft and automobiles to pharmaceuticals and so on, that was foreseen only by visionaries at the beginning of the century. And I think today we are equally unable to predict what will happen technologically. Once the world has decided that this is a moral and ethical issue, that it deserves the full energy of the world, I have great faith in the things that Dan mentioned, the innovation, the ingenuity, the creativity. There is really very little limit, and already we see progress. We see the prices of renewable energy like solar and wind falling dramatically. We see coal companies going bankrupt. We see a move toward electrification of vehicles and so on. There's a lot of progress that's possible. And I think if Paris is evaluated a few decades from now, I hope we'll say this really was a help in making these innovations and this progress possible.
Thank you, Richard. That's very. I hope you're right. I couldn't help be reminded by what you said of when you talked about Paris as a newborn baby and the importance of new technologies, of a very famous story involving physicist Michael Faraday, who created the technology that makes this room possible, discovered the laws of electricity and magnetism that power the world. And he was asked, the Prime Minister came and visited his laboratory and looked at all these weird wheels and said, of what use is this? And he said, of what use is a newborn baby?
Yeah.
But this is what he was reputed to have said.
Yeah.
The other thing he's reputed to have said is why it's so important that one day you'll tax us for it.
Yes.
And that may also be relevant.
That's right.
And that brings me to the question I want to ask the two of you. Is climate change a crisis of capitalism? Is it inextricably tied to the existence of capitalism? So, both of you, Noam, you can start.
Well, in the first place, it certainly follows from the guiding principle. It follows from Adam Smith's Weill maxim. From that, you could almost deduce what you called correctly the greatest market failure in human history, and probably the terminal one. On the other hand, what we call the actual existing societies are not capitalist societies. They're modified in all sorts of ways. I mean, take, for example, the richest man in the world, Bill Gates. He introduced innovations, he had some good ideas and so on. But if you look at the source of his wealth, it's mostly the taxpayer. The basic software, hardware, internet, satellites, microelectronics, it was almost all of it was developed over decades by taxpayer funding. His current wealth is largely a result of the so-called free trade agreements, which are in fact highly protectionist, anti-free trade agreements. They have ridiculously high levels of patent protection, so-called levels that if they'd existed 200 years ago, the United States would now be exporting fish and fur, would have blocked any industrial development. And those are instituted for the benefit of investors. That means that Bill Gates has a monopoly of operating systems, which of course is enormously enriching. And you take a look at the major corporation in the world, Apple, it's about the same. If you take a look at your iPad and you ask who developed what's in it, the technology, the GPS, software and so on, it's the U.S. Navy, taxpayer in one way or another. And notice how radically anti-capitalist that is. In a capitalist society, in principle, if you, say, make a risky investment over a long period and something finally is profitable, you're supposed to get some of the profit. It doesn't work that way here. The investments are made by the taxpayer over decades, very risky. Nobody knew how they were going to turn out. And when finally something turns out to be marketable, it's handed over to private enterprise. You can't imagine a more radical violation of capitalist principle. But what remains, despite all of this, is the Weill maxim. And that's leading to the greatest market failure. So if we can adapt our institutions, which is certainly possible, so that they will work for the public good and restore a conception of our relation to labor, to society, to the environment that is indeed traditional and was ruptured by the forceful introduction of capitalist ideology and institutions. If we can do that, which certainly doesn't seem utopian, yes, then what's called capitalism, whatever they'll call it in the next generation, can adapt.
Okay, that's a hopeful view. Alicia, thank you. You can answer in Spanish, and I'll put on if you want. But you mentioned the word socialism, and it's so fun because we were talking about this earlier, and there was wild applause in the audience, which made me realize I was not in the United States. But maybe you can address this.
Well, no. The only thing I can tell you in English is that Bernie Sanders called himself a socialist, and he was about to win. I have to say.
Yes.
It was in the U.S., by the way. Anyway, cambio al español.
I'll switch into Spanish. I do believe that there is a problem with the way capitalism has been taken to an extreme. I don't think that the market is a bad idea, but the problem is that our society has been put at the service of the market, not the market put at the service of societies. I believe that large corporations that concentrate wealth, technology, and innovation, they are not proposing us to change the way development works. I believe that that is what we require, and that change needs to come. I mean, it's a process in itself. It's a process that must be inclusive. It has to be endogenous. What do I mean? No one will come externally to help for our own development. That's a big mistake. We have to define what kind of society we want for the future. And there, I do believe that climate change brings along a huge question for us to answer. The use of fossil fuels. This huge trend for individual transportation, not carpooling, for example, individual wealth and not collective income. It's being questioned, and I believe that climate change is giving us the opportunity to create a new way of development, a new type of society that I do call a socialist society. For one precise reason, I believe that we need to make equality present. Neoliberalism, I don't know if capitalism per se, but neoliberalism has questioned the role of the state once again, and I believe that that is wrong, because Apple developed due to U.S. taxpayers and due to the military industry. The military industry generated great innovations. So today, what is happening today is that great innovations are being developed. Just a few companies, just a few corporations, but they hold the patent to those inventions, and we're not getting this type of patents in developing countries. And the problem that is quite visible today is who earns more. In this vile reality, as Dr. Chomsky clearly put it, Adam Smith, and the vile reality of my own income, and I'm not going to share it with anybody. So climate change is telling us out loud, beware of the political, social, and economic system that prevails today in many countries.
And well, you couldn't get the applause because I think people were about to applaud, but I didn't want to stop you. But you're in some sense saying this is an opportunity, that climate change.
Yes.
I recently wrote about a Sputnik moment. Is climate change a Sputnik moment to convince the world that we need to change the way we behave, do you think?
Absolutamente. Siempre y cuando.
Absolutely. Provided Dan, Richard, Mario, and Noam, and all of us take this information in the hands of society. The problem is that our citizens need to understand first in order to pressure as much as possible, for example, not to keep on basing our policies in extracting oil and use more sustainable policies instead. But the people.
This morning is la gente.
It's the people. It's the people who will make the biggest changes.
Oh, well, I certainly agree with that, and that's why it's so important to reach people with this message. But Dan had
I have a question for both of you, if you don't mind.
Sure, why not?
Because what you both have said raises for me a dilemma. And here's the dilemma. As a climate scientist and as someone who's thought about energy technology, we need the most rapid innovation and deployment and construction of new infrastructure that the world has ever seen. This is like what happened in the US during World War II, but sustained for a century. It's extraordinary. And many people argue that capitalism is actually the most powerful way to achieve that kind of innovation, that kind of construction, that kind of innovation. Of course, it wasn't exactly capitalism during World War II, which is an interesting question. I struggle with that because we don't need, a new J.D. Rockefeller of renewable energy.
Oh, we do.
And it's not just J.D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie and Bill Gates. I mean, in India, Mukesh Ambani, the head of Reliance, which is like the J.D. Rockefeller of India, lives in a building. His private home is a skyscraper that cost $1 billion. So the question really is, how do you get beyond capitalism when capitalism is so good at the kind of innovation that we need? That's
Okay.
really the dilemma.
Okay, it's an interesting question. We'll take a short answer because I want to get to the student questions.
I mean, what is called capitalism is the source of innovation, but most of the innovation is radically anti-capitalist. I mean, take, say, computers and the internet. Were they capitalist innovations? I mean, it's true that IBM in the early 60s was able finally to construct an in-house computer, the Stretch computer. The reason is they were cannibalizing work that was done at public expense for decades by innovators, Alan Turing, Eckhart Mauchly, others, IBM. There's a reason why every research institution in the country, say MIT, is surrounded by big buildings from capitalist institutions, because they're poaching off the research and innovation that's done by researchers. That's why they're there. In the 1950s and 60s, if you looked around MIT, you saw Raytheon, iTech, trying to, the cutting edge of the economy at the time was electronics based. So you try to raid the sources of public enterprise, often through research universities, sometimes research facilities in non-capitalist institutions. Now, if you look around MIT, big pharmaceutical corporations, Novartis, Pfizer, and so on, well, it's a good reason the cutting edge of the economy has shifted to biology-based institutions. So those who hope to market and profit what is done at public expense are now often pharmaceutical corporations, Biogen and so on. But to go back to IBM and the Stretch computer, they were finally able at public expense to create a computer in-house, but it was much too expensive for business. So the taxpayer stepped in again through procurement. Procurement, it was handed over to Los Alamos, bought it. Procurement turns out to be a major way in which taxpayers fund private profit. Take the internet, as you know perfectly well, it was developed for decades at public expense. It was finally privatized in 1995 in some manner that nobody really understands. After that becomes profitable for Google and others. Steve Jobs was undoubtedly a very effective in designing useful devices, but it was late 70s before he could sell one. That's 30 years after public expense in computer development. And the real innovation is done by people like you, not for profit. That's been true as far back as we go.
Well, let me say that...
Is that capital? Why can't that be done under social public control and public participation? Certainly.
Well, Alicia, your point, the upside of what you just said, I think, is the realization, as has been realized at the National Academy of Sciences study in the United States just showed this, but that 50% of the current gross national product in the United States is due to investments in fundamental research essentially by the government, but not always. When Bell Labs had a monopoly, they used to do that.
Bell Labs.
Yeah.
See, Bell Labs is a very interesting case.
Yeah.
I used to go there all the time back in the 50s. AT&T was able to construct a great research laboratory. It was very closely related to RLE, where I was at MIT. Why? Because they had a government-guaranteed monopoly.
Exactly, it was a monopoly.
Which allowed them, at taxpayer expense, to put some money aside for a research institution. What happened when that was taken away? They killed the lab.
But I think the model, which is a good one, which we should remember, especially at times when governments don't want to fund fundamental research, is that it is actually good for society for governments to support innovation, which then leads to the private sector developing new products. Now, of course, the best thing would be if the products of that were shared by by everybody.
The private sector is mostly involved in marketing.
Yeah.
And there's no reason why, like say drug production. U.S. drug costs are ridiculously high. mostly because of the trade agreements, which give enormous protection to pharmaceutical corporations. There's no reason why the NIH can't fiddle around with molecules to shift drugs around. They could perfectly well.
Okay, we could have this discussion for a long time, but we are going to go a little bit over time. Is that okay with all of you? Good, because even if you said no, we still would, so it doesn't really matter. But I would, instead of asking you to answer that question, I want to get to two student questions. I was going to bring up China earlier. I thought we could discuss China, talking about capitalism, and Mary, maybe you'll want to add something in a second. But let me ask you the question that one of the students asked, which is how can Latin America have autonomy? And I think this is a translation, which is poor, but have autonomy to implant politics according to its needs, namely to basically control its future. So maybe that's a good question for you.
Wow. Well,
if you have a solution,
yes,
it'd be great.
Oh, absolutely not. Pero yo creo que.
But I believe that for Latin America and the Caribbean to reach a better level of development, they have to act in an unfragmented way, because in Latin America there is a huge level of fragmentation, there is inequality, and we see the privatization of education, research, and development, science. I think we have chosen the wrong path. What we have to do is to incentivize a new role of the state that is more assertive, and that's not what we chose as citizens. Citizens are choosing governments that should attack fear, the fear to change, the fear to create a different future. And I believe that in Latin America, we have to diversify ourselves. We are being a continent that lies its resources in extraction. We depend on oil, we depend on minerals. We haven't been able to generate a sustainability based on production. Being productive. We have to, yes, be more productive, but with labor, with jobs, and we have to jump on the bandwagon of this technological paradigm. I agree with Dan in terms of the fact that Fordism and the American capitalism, when electricity was invented, it was wonderful because the use of electricity was mainstreamed. But we are facing a different situation. Yes, we're mainstreaming, of course, other goods, internet, but the consumption of internet, we don't produce. We're very good users of internet, but we're not producing goods and services that might give us the opportunity to have better jobs, more inclusive jobs, and more wealth. I believe that Latin America has to revisit its own development model from the core. I believe that we are using free trade in excess, and it's very protectionistic, I should say.
It's a complicated problem, and it was a big question to ask you, but I appreciate you taking it. The next student question, I'm going to ask Mara to answer, and then it was asked of Noam, but I thought maybe it might be help you bring up what you were going to bring up before. But I think it's an important question that almost every young person in the audience is asking, which is, do you think individual actions can lead to find a solution to the big problems we face as humanity? I think that's a question everyone asks, and so we'll talk about that in some length, but Mario, maybe you could start with that and then address what. Okay.
I'm going to switch to.
Okay, I have my.
Se me olvidó, pero creo que hablé en inglés
okay.
antes. La pregunta es.
The question here would be whether individual activities, how much can they help in all this? I think they are very important, provided they're not done in hiding. The important thing about individual activities, etc., is for them to be done on a group basis, to be able to communicate it to our decision makers. If not, practically, they have no importance. We cannot address or solve these problems in a voluntary fashion, or it is therefore very important for this to be reflected on the political world, everything we do personally through partnerships, associations, or whatever. But if you give me half a minute, Well, I wanted to add something. I think we're talking about very general issues and then very specific topics. What I wanted to add is the following. For an extremely important topic for the future to improve the quality of life, equality and equality, I think education, modern education is fundamental. With you, you play an extremely important role, and you have to learn, given the speed at which things are changing. But that will take time. We don't have time with the problem of climate change that's there over us. We cannot, we do not need the U.S. to change from capitalism to a different system. In a few years' time, this cannot happen overnight in Mexico or anywhere else. With current systems, that's why I gave the example of ozone layer, because all the countries in the world agreed on this. Let me give you another very important example. It's air quality, because developed countries, the U.S. and Europe, in spite of the fact that this was against the interests of those that manufacture cars and planes and things like that. In spite of that, governments were able to agree on this, and they set rules, and the air quality is a lot better than what we would have without those government measures. Mexico City is a great example for this. The air quality at the end of last century was fatal. We improved it a lot, but we haven't yet solve the problem 100%, but it can be done. Yes, it can be done. If that's what we have to do with climate change in this decade, we're not going to be able to wait 3 or 4 decades to see if people change, to see if the system changes, because then we're going to already have a disaster for future generations. And we are really very close to this, because fortunately we have rich people. Bill Gates, you've quoted him, you mentioned him, but also Google and in Microsoft. I mean, we're working with them. There are others like the Cohen brothers that are very far away from this, but we can change things in a few years' time. Of course, this can be done, but we all have to work together and do make a lot more noise than we're already making today. But don't get any illusions. The thinking of changing society, perhaps 2 or 3 centuries, perhaps we can face these problems. We have to do it right now.
Thank you. And because of time, Noam, I want to give you the last word on answering that same question before I go to a quick round of one question with one sentence answer for each of you.
So the question is, can individual actions contribute to dealing with this existential crisis? It depends very much what the individual actions are. So if a particular individual says, look, I'm going to adopt a primitive lifestyle. I'm going to go off to Montana, find a little plot of land somewhere. I'm going to raise my own food. I'm not going to use any fossil fuels and so on. The effect is essentially zero. But if the individual acts the way we in fact act, namely as part of a community, then the individual act can make a great difference. So take, say, the mass popular movement, which finally developed in the United States and was a main factor in ending the Vietnam War before Indochina was totally destroyed. Much too late, but it had an effect. How did it develop? Through individuals, but not individuals saying, I don't like the war. I remember very well how it began. When I began early in the Kennedy administration, when the war was taking off, trying to give talks about it, it was in somebody's living room with a couple of neighbors who were brought, or it was in a church with 4 people there, the minister, the organizer, a drunk who walked in from outside, and a guy who wanted to kill me. That went on for years. Finally, many actions like that led to a huge mass popular movement. Here we need a major popular movement, and it has to act on many fronts. Take, say, just one other illustration of a radically anti-capitalist phenomenon that we're all familiar with, but we never think about: consumption. There's a huge, anyone who's taken a course in economics knows that markets and the whole theory is based on the idea that you have informed consumers making rational choices. We have a huge industry in the United States that spends hundreds of billions of dollars to try to undermine markets. It's called the advertising industry, the public relations industry. It's trying to create uninformed consumers who will make irrational choices. Take a look at an ad on television for an automobile. If we had a market system working by economic principles, what you'd see is a short notice by General Motors saying, here are the characteristics of the automobile that I'm producing. Here's a report from Consumers Report saying it doesn't work very well, and so on. That would help create informed consumers making rational choices. You don't see that. What you see is a movie star, a professional athlete, car shooting up in the stratosphere or something. Now that's a huge industry, has a major effect on our lives. If an individual says, okay, I see through it, I'm not going to fall for it anymore, that again has no effect. But if that individual is part of a community of people who are educating themselves and others and deconstructing the whole complex institutional structure, that can break that down completely and turn huge wasted resources into exactly the kind of development that you mentioned is absolutely necessary if we're going to get out of this crisis. So yes, individuals can do a lot as part of communities.
That is a very important message, and it's especially important now that young people hear it, and I'll talk about it in my concluding remarks in a second, but that's why I turned to you, because you demonstrated through the Vietnam War that young people may not realize that the public can make big changes. There was the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which also ended largely the detonation of nuclear weapons in the world. Happened. It was signed by Nixon, but he wasn't a pacifist, because the public reached out, and public movements can affect things. So individuals, as part of communities, can affect things. Which leads me to the last question. One sentence apiece. Are you optimistic? Go.
I am very optimistic because I think civilization, after all, is making a huge progress. We have less poor people and so on and so forth. We have huge challenges, but I'm optimistic that, perdón, hablo en inglés.
Sorry, I spoke English. I'm very optimistic because I think the rationale, the reasoning and intelligence have taken civilization exactly where we are. And once more, if we collaborate, I think this is something we're learning to do a lot better now. If we all collaborate, if we work together, then we all end up winning. But we do have to reach agreements. We have to agree on this. I'm very optimistic, yes.
I'm sure it was profound, but I didn't understand it. Richard.
I'm fundamentally optimistic because I have great confidence in young people. And I think the young people will take over from the people who don't see the problem.
Good. This is good. Dan?
I agree with both Richard and Mario. I think there's a lot of reason for optimism, but I think we should find that optimism in seeing clearly the mountain we have to climb. We shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that this is going to be easy. At the same time, human creativity is extraordinary. I think it's going to transform our world. I think climate change is going to transform national boundaries, global governance, and our economy. I think it's going to have to, because the alternative is unthinkable. And I think it's going to be very interesting to watch. You know, the Chinese, what is sometimes called a curse, may you live in interesting times. Well, that is our fate.
Yes, thank you. It's also
It's been interesting times.
Tom Whitaker's.
Larry,
Alicia?
I'm very optimistic. Soy muy optimista.
I'm very optimistic. I am very optimistic, but I do believe that we need deep changes. Business as usual is not working. Yes, we need to take urgent actions. We need to choose specific sectors: energy, transportation, cities, agriculture, and work on it. But I do believe that we must fight to see structural changes, deep down progressive structural changes. And I am a firm believer that only with inclusion, with equality, that we're going to get ourselves there. We should not have bigger gaps between us. I agree, together, as part of the same community, and fighting for the global commons as peace, climate security, but the road is not going to be even. Therefore, I'm inviting everyone to change this conversation between the state, the market, and society, and create new coalitions, political coalitions actually, with the youth and specifically with women. We need women.
And Noam?
Well, I think the basic question is really very simple. We have a choice. Each of us has a choice. We can say the world is terrible, it's hopeless, I'll give up, and we can help ensure that the worst will happen. Or we can say, look, there are opportunities, which is a fact, there are possibilities, I'll work to try to grasp them, I'll work with others to try to realize them, and then we can help make the world a better place. It's not really much of a choice.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you to all of you. I have to say that my answer to my own question was, I'm reminded a friend of mine who's a writer of a very dark novels named Cormac McCarthy. He's very dark, but I met him and he was a very happy guy. And I asked him, how can he be so happy? And he said, I'm a pessimist, but that's no reason to be gloomy. And I think of that when I think of this issue. And two things else that I think about. Two quotes. One by Louis Pasteur, fortune favors the prepared mind. That's why we're here. To meet the challenges of the 21st century, we have to be prepared for them. And that means accepting reality for what it is. There's another quote by the physicist Max Planck, who said, science progresses one funeral at a time. Because we're here for young people. And you are the future. It's too old for the people our age. And for most people, because we live in a world where people, in fact, as a scientist, science is presented as a set of facts instead of a process for deriving facts, a way to tell sense from nonsense. And it is incumbent upon you, young people, to learn that process and use it and become part of a community that can change the future. And that's why we're here tonight. And I hope that's the lesson that you get. And I want to thank all of you for coming and this wonderful panel. Thank you very much. Good night. Thank you.
Buenas noches, agradecemos su presencia y los invitamos a que asistan o sigan la transmisión de nuestras próximas actividades de este coloquio, los acosos a la civilización, de muro a muro. en la Ciudad de México, martes 21, miércoles 22.